All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. This is our fourth professional development workshop. If you're new, I'm Cheyenne Martin. I'm the program manager for the South Texas Community Health Worker Workforce Preparedness Collaborative, which provides and facilitates the expansion of training and professional development opportunities for community health workers across the 38 counties of South Texas. Today, if you stay on until the end, you can, and you're a certified CHW or Promotora, you can apply for one non-DSHS certified CEU. So please stay on for the whole hour. And I'm very excited to introduce Christy Rosenfeld. She is a leadership development coach and, sorry, Christy, I have to look at my phone, the HR strategic process manager at HEB. So has training in having difficult conversations and navigating those. And if you are a community health worker in the workforce, then you might already have had to experience some difficult conversations. And so Christy's gonna give us some strategies for addressing those. Christy, over to you.
Awesome. I am getting ready to share my screen. All right. I feel like it's always a moment to make sure all the screens are in place. Can you see?
Yes.
Screens. Okay. Thank you for that introduction. I would love for this to be interactive. So if you can, come turn your camera on, come off mute when you have a chance. Definitely want this to be something that you can hopefully take something and walk away from. Take some tidbits so that after the session, you'll have something to walk away with. So what I'm hoping that we get out of today's session is an understanding of why conversations can be difficult. And then I want y'all to be able to learn just 3 things you can do to prepare for difficult conversations. This is only an hour, and a lot of this content can be covered within like 2-day workshops and all of that. So I'm squeezing what I can into an hour. Definitely ask questions along the way, and we'll definitely hopefully have time for questions at the end as well. And Cheyenne, if you don't mind, just if anything comes through chat, if you'll help me with the chat.
Of course.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay, so first things first, I want to get an understanding from y'all. When you were a child, what strategies and tactics did you use to try and get your way? So if you can share in chat or come off mute, feel free to come off mute and tell me, what are some of the things that when you were a child, how did you get your way? Crying, yes, it was a very popular one, crying. Pleading, yes, definitely. Tantrums come to mind, right? Manipulation is a big one. The sad eyes, yes, pouting, all of those things for sure. As you asked your grandparents, yes, you knew those people that would help you get your way for sure. So yeah, there's probably a lot of shouting that went on. There was some pouting for sure. The silent treatment, yes, the body language, all of those things come into play when you're a kid. Because those are the first times that you're learning to communicate, learning and figuring out, how do I go about hard conversations when things aren't going my way. So now let me ask you, now that you're an adult, what has changed about with your strategies? What are some of the things you do? How have you evolved your strategies to get your way? Bribe. Yes, we can do that. Jedi mind tricks. I love it. Yes. Dialogue, talking. Yes. Ideally, we have evolved our tactics. But a lot of times, it's hard when maybe the other person that we're talking to hasn't evolved their tactics, right? And so I like that. Nobody cares if I cry, which is good. I'm hoping to build a a world where we can all be authentic in how we communicate. And if that involves showing who, you know, how we're really feeling, then that should be fine. That should be okay. I like the understanding of using leading language. I would suggest, or it might be helpful. Yeah. All important things to know. Like, yes, we have evolved our strategies as adults, but what else can we do to evolve? So I think some understanding a little bit more about how we communicate as adults is important. And so there's a psychology professor out of the University of California and called Albert Mehrabian, and he constructed this idea of silent messages. And so when you're in conversation and dialogue with people, 7% of your message is getting across by the words that you're using. 38% of your message is being interpreted by the tone of voice that you're using. And then 55% of your message is getting across to the other person through your body language. So the tone of voice and the body language are out of your control. Yes, you can manage them and you can make sure that you're presenting yourself in a certain way. However, the interpretation of the other person is not up to you, it's up to them. And so really what it comes down to is communication is 7% about what you say and 93% out of your control. It's about who you're saying it to and what they're bringing to the table. So it's important to know and remember that as we go into conversations and as we approach what might be considered difficult conversations, just knowing that, you know, you could have done all the things that you needed to do to have a great conversation with somebody. But if that other person is distracted, has stress going on in their world, is, you know, dealing with a lot of things, they might not be open and understanding and seeing the full picture of what you're trying to present. And how you're trying to have the conversation. So I want to start getting into understanding what kind of hard conversations you have in the work that you do. So in chat or come off mute, feel free to come off mute. In your work, when do you have a hard time communicating effectively with people? What are some of the things that you are challenged with? Yes. So Paula, 100% when you're on Zoom and everyone's camera is off, that's a tough one for sure. Emails and IM. Yes, there is so much that happens in written forms of communication or text messages where you can add the story around the content that is being shared. So yes, 100%. There are language barriers. Yes, language and cultural barriers are present a big challenge. Any other ones? Okay, when it comes to promoting yourself, yes, that's a hard, that can be very hard. Sharing not so good news, saying no, those are hard things. Yes, when you perceive the other person is not interested or doesn't care. Not asking for clarification when I have to talk about advanced directives. Yes, those are tough. When you're put on the spot and you're asked to respond to a certain policy in front of people, yeah, that can be really challenging when you don't feel prepared. Yeah, so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is just understanding what you can bring to the table to prepare for some of these difficult conversations that you might have time to prepare for. So of some of these things, what is the most challenging? What is it that makes the interaction so challenging? So we've kind of highlighted some of them. When conducting an HM visit and the TV is on. Yeah. So I'd say when you're in a conversation, like, and the other person is distracted, right? 100%. Don't know how to approach. Okay. So that's hopefully what we're going to talk about today. Cultural age gap. Yeah. Yeah. Those are hard. The cultural gap between generations is just getting bigger and bigger. We needing to know and understand how to communicate with each other, I think is really important. All right. So let's talk about a couple things that make a conversation crucial. Like, what makes a conversation really difficult? Oh yeah, Guadalupe, when power dynamics are involved. Yes. So some of this content today that I'm pulling from is from a book and a course called Crucial Conversations. So if you have your chance to get your hands on this book, it really lays out a whole bunch of tactics that you can spend, days really diving into. I wanted to pull some of the content from it because I think it's really handy, especially breaking down like what makes a conversation crucial or what makes a conversation difficult. There are really three elements. And that's when you have opposing opinions, there are strong emotions, or they're high stakes. Yes. Wanting to also people talking on the phone when we're talking to them. So that is definitely when people aren't at the same level that you're at, right? And that's probably where those opposing opinions come in. So let's talk about these three things a little bit. So opposing opinions are basically, we can go as challenging as like opposing political viewpoints, to people just not being on the same page with what needs the conversation that needs to happen. So I've seen come through chat a few things that have said, like people talking on their phone or people having the TV on, like people are just not on the same page as far as like what conversation needs to happen. Strong emotions. If you're feeling very passionate about a topic and so is the other person, or even if the other person isn't feeling passionate and you are, the moment that passion arises for you makes it a crucial conversation because you know that there are stakes involved. You know that either a value of yours is being challenged, or something that you truly believe in is being challenged. And so those kinds of stakes make it all come together to make it a really crucial, tough conversation. Oh, Ciara, Syria, is that how you say your name? I love that you're reading the book. So you can really dive into the content and share hopefully what you're learning with other people. So all of these things make difficult conversations. And what we want to understand is when you're diving into a crucial conversation, how do we approach it? What do we need to do to deal with it? So when we understand conversations, this is the model from the book, the Crucial Conversations model. Again, I'm not going to go deep into this. I want to pull a couple of things out of it. And the first thing I want to show you on this model is there's a before, a during, and after. So there are things you can do before you get to the conversation. There are things that you can do during the conversation and understand. And then of course, there are things at the end that you want to make sure you're following up and circling back to the person. But we'll get into the before here momentarily, but this pool of shared meaning, this thing right in the middle, I want to dive into a little bit more. Ultimately, what this is saying is when you get into a conversation, you're coming at it with your own perspective and the other person is coming at it from their own perspective. And so what this means is you're each coming to the conversation with your very own opinions, your feelings, theories, stories, experiences, everything that creates your world and that informs your passion, informs your decisions, informs your content, your facts, all of that you're bringing to the table. And like I said, all of that for somebody else, for that other person is also being brought to the table. So, I think about some of the conversations that you actually mentioned, where someone is distracted. That could be a form of them putting up a wall and not wanting to be a part of the conversation and not really wanting to lean into the conversation because it's really difficult, because the stakes are high. So I think understanding that, yes, they're coming to the table, but they might not fully be there. It happens. That's part of what, understanding difficult conversations and how to approach them. It's part of understanding that you're both coming to the table, coming to the conversation with these things. So when you get to a tough conversation, where do you start? You have to start with ourselves, because we can't control the other person. All we can do is really make sure that we're doing everything we can to be fully open, to be aware of what we're bringing to the table, and then be open to what the other person is also bringing, and how can we engage them. So let's break this down a little bit. If we're going to start with ourselves and we're going to do some preparing, what do we do? So there are 3 things we can do to prepare for a difficult conversation. And that's know your stories, identify what needs to be addressed in the conversation, and clarify your intent. And let's break these things down together and we'll talk about it. And these are nuanced from what you'd find in the book. But they're definitely in there in much more detail. So when I talk about know your stories, this one is one that I talk about with my husband a lot. We know your stories. So when I say know your story, it's really, you're telling yourself a story. When you come to the table in a conversation, you're coming to the table with not just the facts, but with your interpretation of the facts. And so the best thing you can do is understand, what is that interpretation that you're telling yourself? What is that story you're telling yourself? So if you can, and you have a chance to prepare, say you have a really hard conversation that you're going to go into, or you're having a challenging conversation with your spouse or your significant other, or maybe it's your boss at work, but you know that you're feeling passion around it. There's stakes involved. There's some sort of high stakes are involved for you. So figure out, what is the story that you're telling yourself. So this is where I say, I recommend find a confidant, someone that you trust, that you can say, hey, I want to kind of break this down with you. And so find that person, that safe person that you can actually kind of practice with ahead of time, so that you can actually tease out the story. So as you're telling the full story, ask yourself, what are the facts? What are the actual things that are happening? Was it a text message that was sent? An email that was sent, or the way a person specifically behaved? All right, those are some of the facts. The story that comes in is the interpretation, is the rest of that. So if you know that there was an email that was sent, let's go with like a text message, because how often does a text message get misinterpreted? So just think about that. Think about the last time you got a text message from somebody and you reacted very strongly about it. And think about, if you were just to read the words without any intonation, without any kind of context, just read the words. And maybe a lot of times the words themselves are just words. You're putting the intonation on them. You're adding the drama to it. So this is where when I have conversations with my husband a lot, we talk about, yes, that email came through now, and he'll read it with a lot of passion. And I'll say, okay, read it again, but don't read it with any kind of inflection. Just read it straightforward. And or have somebody else read it. And then if like I were to read it back to him, then the interpretation would be different, because I don't have the baggage of the relationship that I'm bringing to the table. So it's really important to know, to really start to dig into, okay, what are the facts of the story, and what is the story that I'm telling myself? So I want us to start practicing this a little bit, because talking about it in theory can only go so far. So think of a recent conversation that you've had and see if you can tease out the story. So if you're willing to and want to share in chat or come off mute, feel free to kind of share what was something recently that you've had. Yes, I'm happy to share. Shan, I'm happy to share my slides. I know that just came through. I will absolutely share my slides.
Right above that, David has an example. He said, I had a difficult conversation with one of my brothers about my mom who does not want to be resuscitated.
So, David, this sounds like one that is high stakes are involved, right? A lot of emotions are involved, probably a lot of passion. What, if you're willing to share, what was really challenging about this specific conversation?
There we go. Sorry, I was trying to turn on the camera here because I know you requested that. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Rivera. I work here in Austin. That conversation was pretty difficult. I'm the youngest of 5 brothers. My mom is 87 years old, and I'm the primary power of attorney for my mom. And on one of our visits, we had a conversation with her primary care. We did some dialogue in regards of what's going to happen in case if my mom were to have a heart attack or something like that. And then we explained that one of the things that they're going to do is try to resuscitate you and do chest compression and all sorts of stuff. So my mom is 87 years old and she's pretty frail right now. And so with her primary care, the 3 of us, we discussed it and provided a form to fill out. And so we took it home. I still had to explain it to my mom what that means, what it does. And of course she said, no, I don't want them to do that. If I go, I go. I don't want them to press on my chest. They're gonna break my ribs and so on and so forth. So then of course, I took her home. She lives with my brother number 3.
Yeah.
And then, I had to start that conversation. So of course my brother, he's like my first responder. He's the one who lives with my mom. So in case if something were to happen to my mom, he's the first to respond. And so I actually had to show him stop the bleed. I had to teach him chest compression and things like that and what that entailed. But then I show up with this form that my mom was about to fill out and sign. And of course, it was the complete opposite, right, of what we had talked about for the last several months in case if something were to happen to my mom. And so it didn't go very well for him. He did not see it as a form of her wanting this. It was more of a, well, if she's gonna die, she's gonna die. And so anyhow, there was a lot of emotions going on there. So I took it to heart for what he said, but it was something that my mom wanted. So still to this day, for the last 3 months, we've been having this conversation slowly, but it doesn't go very well. He understands, but it doesn't go very well.
Right. Oh, thank you for sharing that, David. That is a really high stakes and hard conversation to have. The emotions that are there, you can't stop those conversations from, they absolutely have to happen. And I think the most important thing about those conversations is hopefully staying and understanding where your brother is at, right? And how, and really just trying to hear and acknowledge them. So if we go back to the start, when I asked you, how did you communicate when you were younger? How did you get your way when you were younger? We do what we can to feel heard and to feel seen. And as adults, we're still trying to do those same things, right? We're still trying to understand, like, how do I make sure that I feel acknowledged and I feel seen? And in when hard conversations break down, a lot of the breakdown happens because one of the people doesn't feel like they're being acknowledged. Their emotion, their passion, their truth is not being acknowledged, right? And so part of understanding these, how to have difficult conversations is being able to show up for somebody else in that conversation and acknowledge what they're feeling, in order to help guide the conversation where it needs to go. So I really thank you for sharing that example. That's not an easy one to share, but it's one, I'm sure, a version of one that we've had in many places, in many spaces, especially in the work that y'all do, right? And ultimately, difficult conversations is the whole thing that you want to do when you approach a difficult conversation is show up as and be authentic and be open to, where the other person is at, but also fully understanding and knowing, like, what are you bringing to the table? What is the passion and the interpretations that you're bringing to the table? So this is the first step, right? Is to know that and understand what is that story that you spin in your head. If the person is coming to the passion, to the conversation with a lot of passion, like, what is that story you tell yourself about that other person versus the facts of the story? Because the story you tell is your interpretation, right? Is your interpretation of what they're saying. So let's keep building on, like, what are some of those things that what else can we do? So if you know your story, then the next thing you can do, and I see someone just responded in chat. How do you respond to the other person not being receptive when an individual's well-being is involved? Ooh, that's a tough one. And this actually, I think, will hopefully help, is identify what needs to be addressed. So let's talk about this a little bit and see if this helps, Syria. This is something where you want to make sure that in the conversation, you're hitting on the right conversation. Because if you're hitting on the wrong thing, then ultimately maybe the person doesn't feel like, again, they're getting acknowledged, or it just doesn't hit the way it needs to hit. So there's content, pattern, and relationship. And content is specific. Like, if you're dealing with something and it's a one-time occurrence, right? It's happened one time, but it's really bothering you. That's what we're talking about when we talk about content. It's a single thing that's happening. The action itself or its immediate consequences are the issue, right? So something has happened and you need to address it right then and there, or at some point, right? One specific instance has happened. A pattern is when it's a recurring problem. And this is when, say, something just keeps happening. And I think about it in, like, the work context. If someone is late to work one time and I'm responsible for that person, I'm going to say, hey, you know what? I noticed you showed up late today. Everything okay? And they'll be like, yeah, the bus ran late today, and but I'm here. No problem. But if all of a sudden it's 3 weeks and the person has been late 3 different times each week, so now it's like 9 times, right, that they've shown up late to the job that they're supposed to do. That's no longer just one instance. That's a recurring pattern. Something is happening that's creating a pattern that needs to be addressed, because maybe the start time of the shift doesn't work anymore. Maybe the daycare center's hours have changed. And so that's when I'm going to go back to that person and say, hey, you know what? I've noticed that you're now showing up late on these days. What's going on? Like, what can I do? What do we need to do to address this so that you can, that you can show up when you're supposed to show up and not get in trouble? Relationship is how when you need to identify and really focus on the relationship part of the conversation. This is when the things that have happened, all the things that are happening it's not just a cause and effect, but they're actually affecting the relationship of the person. So if I've had this conversation with somebody, I've said, okay, I noticed when you were late one time when we had a conversation. We had a conversation when you had a pattern of being late, and you said that we were going to make things and adjust things. Well, we've made those adjustments, and now you're still showing up late. And now it's causing me to not have trust with you anymore. Like, the trust that I've built with you is now being eroded because we've had all these conversations and the behavior is still happening. And so now our relationship is being affected. So, helping to really understand, is it a one-time thing? Is it a pattern of things? Or is the relationship that's at stake? What are the things that need to be talked about? So really teasing that out is really important. the most persistent, resistant problems are caused by a failure to address issues at the pattern or relationship level. And so I think that that's really important. I think, look at this. It's a weed. Think about a weed and how a weed always comes back if you don't get it at its roots, right? If you go out into your garden every day and you pull up that same weed, but you're just pulling off the greens and the flower, then that weed is going to keep coming back every time. So what we're trying to say is, look, if this relationship, if this thing keeps happening, then what you need to do is hit at something that's on the deeper level. And so is it that pattern, or is it the relationship that's now being the issue that you want to talk about? So that is a way that you can clarify, really understand to get at the right issue, content, pattern, or relationship. And the other thing is to clarify your intent. So think about the intent that you bring to the conversation. Thanks, Paula. Think about your mindset that you bring to the conversation. There are healthy and unhealthy intent or motives when approaching a conversation. So when I think about unhealthy, I think about when I'm approaching a conversation, if I'm in the mindset of, I want to be right, I want to make sure that I look good, I want to win, I want to win this conversation, or if I'm trying to avoid conflict, all of those things are unhealthy motives that I'm bringing to the conversation. And I'm going in already at ready to put up a fight. Like I'm going in fists up, right? But if I go in and I have an intent or motive to learn about the situation more, to help figure out what the truth is, I want to produce results. So if I'm trying to make sure that we're doing something, that we're achieving something together, or if I'm trying to grow the relationship, that's the motive that I can come to those are going to be healthy motives that I'm coming to the table with. And so I think about David's example, or I think about Syria in your what you put in the chat. How do you respond to the other person if they're not receptive when an individual's well-being is involved? I think really understanding, like, how are you approaching the conversation? And so what is your motive going to the conversation? Are you going in to make sure that you're right and that you get the other person to see your perspective? Or are you going into the conversation to learn more about what is holding up that other person? What is where could they be at on how they're feeling about this issue? If you're going in with that curious mindset, that open mindset, then that's going to make a big difference in the conversation. Something else that I think is interesting, when you go in with an unhealthy focus, you're really me-centric. You're saying, I'm going in and it's all about me. But if you're going in with a healthy motive, you're actually in the we focus. You're actually not just focused about what you can get out of the conversation. You're focused on how do we come out of this conversation better, and with a stronger relationship, with clarity on what we're trying to resolve. Are you coming at it from a me perspective or a we perspective? So the thing about clarifying your intent is that it's great if you clarify it for yourself, but that's not enough. It's really helpful in conversations if you can actually share your intent with the other person. And that's where I think if you can come at a conversation where the other person is having a really hard time, and say, look, I'm here. We're both here to help our mom out. We're both here because we're focused on the well-being of this other person that we both truly care about. And then sharing that up front will hopefully maybe help the other person come to the table, or at least open up to the conversation. So I'm going to pause there and ask for questions, or is there conversations or other examples that are coming up for you that that this maybe could be helpful with?
I like this because basically, yeah, there are so many things that come up that we always say to ourselves, I just don't have time for this, And so in the long run, having getting at the core of it, I like the idea about pulling it up by the roots as opposed to just taking off the top of it,
Mm.
So anyway, getting really down to the root cause of what's going on and then moving on from there. It does save time and a lot of headache, and in the future it creates better trust. So I like the way you put this.
Appreciate that, Paula. I think something also that you made me think of is real. You're 100% right in saying that if you were to connect and actually have that crucial conversation at the content level, you would potentially prevent having to have the crucial conversation when it becomes a pattern or when it becomes something that's affecting the relationship. And so I think a lot of us shy away from hard conversations and difficult conversations because they feel so hard. But if you hit it now versus waiting waiting too long, then either the issues snowball or they get out of proportion, or you continue to tell yourself stories that make it worse and worse and worse. And so the sooner you can engage in a hard conversation, the sooner you can actually get to clarity and hopefully a lighter heart. You take some of that stress off of yourself because you're not carrying the weight of the hard conversation around with you. Irene, I thought I saw you come off mute, so I wanted to just verify if you had a question.
I did come off mute. And hello and good afternoon, everybody. I don't have a question. I was just going to, I was just thinking about this, share your intent with the other person and just what that looks like, up front, in what can potentially be a difficult conversation. And that is it's wisdom, I think. That's a very wise statement because it sets the groundwork for, what the conversation is going to be, and maybe puts your, you can share your intent up front. You're telling the other person, you're setting up the outcome or the hopeful outcome for the conversation. So I just thought that's really good. A really wise piece of advice for us to take away. But I also was thinking when Paula was speaking, I was remembering a conversation that I didn't have with someone years back now, and I often share with other people about having a difficult conversation and the need to do it when you can. I learned from that I needed to have this conversation with the person. They asked me something that showed me that they were questioning my trust about something that they had experienced. And I really wanted to go back to them and say, hey, you asked me this thing, and I was a little, taken aback by that you asked me that, and the reasons why that I was, and I wanted to share that with them, and I never did. I didn't call them on the carpet on what they said to me. And I think because I didn't do that, the relationship, I don't have a relationship with that person. Like they left the relationship thinking of me a certain way because I didn't have the courage in that moment to have that difficult conversation to say, hey, you said this to me, but that's not the case at all. This is actually the case. Or why would you even ask me that? Like I needed to have a difficult conversation that I didn't have.
Yeah.
And I wish that I had. But it was because I was just trying to avoid the conflict. I wasn't courageous enough in that moment. But I learned that sometimes you do have to have that difficult conversation, pull up that root so that it doesn't pop up anymore. So very wise.
Irene, I love that you brought it back to courage too, because I think that is so, that's a really key point. Like going into a hard conversation, into a difficult conversation takes a lot of courage. And especially when I know when when my heart starts pounding or I get sweaty, that I know that I'm getting into a hard conversation. And I know that I'm learning as I continue in my life, like learning over the course of my life that the longer it takes me to respond to that, the harder and the more stress and the stress that I get and potentially losing out on relationships. So I do appreciate that you brought that up. I think that's really important. I see in the Q&A that Julia asked a question, how do you address another person if you feel intimidated by that other individual? So that's a great question. And I know that I've definitely been in that place before. And I would say I'm going to go back to what Irene said. It takes courage, first of all, and it's going to take vulnerability. You can't have courage without vulnerability, right? You can't step into these hard conversations without putting yourself out there. So recognizing that it's going to be hard is good. And I would say get really clear on what it is you want to get out of that conversation with that person. Like, what do you need from them? Is it, go back to the content pattern relationship, or is it something specific? Do you have, get really clear on the ask for that person. And then I think also sharing your intent, I think will go a long way to opening the door to, for me, also diffusing it for myself. Like if I go in and I share my my intent and be like, you know what, this is a really important question and conversation that I want to have with you. And that also helps set the stage for them so that they know like it's important and that it's a big deal for me to come into the conversation with them. But a lot of it for me is also just doing the time up front to feel prepared for the conversation. And knowing that if they respond to me in the way that I hoped, great. If they didn't, if it went differently, at least I know that I did my part to put myself out there. Does that help, Julia? It's okay. If you can share in chat, or I see you came off mute. Let's see. All right. Well, while we, Julia, you let us know if there's more you want to get out of that. And while we do, Tia, you've raised your. Oh
Can
yes,
you hear me now?
yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, that helps me a lot. I recently went back to school and I encountered a person that was very intimidating and I did not know how to deal with them. But at the same time, I was dealing with a loss in my life. So it was sort of like a double whammy at the time. And so I just got sort of like more and more upset when she would bring up the conversation that had nothing to do with what we were doing. So I did not know how to deal with it until the teacher actually told me to just calm down and to think about what it is I was trying to say to this other person. So eventually we got our project done and we got through the school semester. So now she became a good friend of mine after that conversation. So.
Oh, that's great, Julia. I feel like that's a happy ending to you overcoming that that hard conversation and getting out there what you needed to get out there. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Tia, yes.
I'm sorry, I was having issues unmuting. Hi, Miss Irene. I was actually, so I'm a realist, okay, and I have to be completely honest with you. It's amazingly inspiring to have courage, right, and to be able to speak to someone. But how much does that take from someone that doesn't have the courage to speak, right? So what is another option? Because there comes a time where, like with me, I'm very vocal. I see how I feel, whether it's good or bad, right? I have very great relationships with people, but in the same aspect, sometimes people may feel like that's a little intimidating, but I'm not trying to be, right? So if there's something that they're trying to say, what is another option? So they can have courage to speak to me, and I'm speaking back to them with my pleasant voice and my smiles, and that's not enough because they're still a little bit intimidated. So what is another option? Like, how can I help them?
I love that, Tia, because I feel like you just queued this up perfectly.
Yeah.
Because the next thing I wanted to share was actually like what you can do to notice the other person in the conversation. So it sounds like you're asking like, okay, well, if you're that intimidating person, how do I make the space for someone else to share with me? Is that what you're asking?
Like that, and also how do I help them? Like,
Yes.
what do you give someone that is going through that? Because I don't feel like I'm intimidating. I feel like I'm very bubbly. I feel like I'm happy. But somebody else, because of my strong speaking, sometimes they might feel like, oh, I don't want to talk. Like, she might feel some type of way, but I'm not that way. But how do you help them with that? Like, if there was not a Tia around and they would have to like meet someone else eventually, maybe another Tia, how would they handle that? What would they have other than courage? What else would they have, like, so that they can be able to figure it out? Is it an equal medium? Call someone to the side. Can you help me have this conversation? Or, like that. Okay, I'm stop talking.
I love that, Tia. I think that there are things you can do in the conversations when you notice that. And then I think there are things we can do for each other to help each other out, right? So first, so we talked about these three things, which is, okay, know your stories, identify what needs to be addressed, and clarify your intent. And then I was going to say, okay, as a bonus for our time today, explore the other person's path. And so if your goal in the dialogue is, if your goal is dialogue and safety, what kinds of questions could you ask to make sure that you're hearing from that other person? And I think this goes to what you're saying a little bit, Tia, is if you're in that conversation, how do you make sure that you're inviting the other person along? So I think it's also being very aware of like the other person's, their body language, how they're saying things and what they're saying. So noticing if they maybe aren't speaking up like you thought they could, or maybe that they have other things that they are saying. So what are some of the questions you can ask? So I think bottom line is like, how do you engage them in the conversation? And so I think really thinking about some of these questions. And so these questions are phrased in a way of like, is this a good question or is this a bad question? So I want y'all to weigh in on this. Like, so if I'm going into the conversation and I'm to Tia's point, I'm noticing that I'm dominating, but I want to bring in the person more into the conversation. So would asking the question, how do you see it? Could that work? It's open-ended, it's inviting them to share their perspective. What about the question, isn't that the case? Do you think that's as open-ended, or do you think that's as inviting of a question? No, right? Tia's doing the thumbs down. You're right. No, it's not, because it's closed, and you're also implying that the way you see it is the way the other person sees it. So, so go with the first one. How do you see it versus isn't that the case, right? So how do you see it is the better question of those two. What about, what's your view on this? Right? That one is another open-ended, good question to invite them in to say, okay, what are you seeing? What's your perspective? What's your view? What about this one? No one disagrees with that, do they? That's not, that'll shut people down right away. It's a question, but it's a very guided and it's a very leading question, right? So again, you're going to want to ask those open-ended questions, those one that invite people to share their perspectives. So another one, can you help me understand your perspective? Could that one work? Yeah. Right. It's technically a closed question because it says can first, or you could just change it with, help me understand your perspective. So really, again, thinking about those questions that are really going to invite someone to share. And I think to Tia's point, if you notice someone, courage takes practice. So that's the other thing. I would say if I had anything else to say about Tia's question, it's really that courage takes practice. and help from the people around us, right? Help from our community to maybe practice ahead of time, practice actually going into those crucial conversations, and really going in with that thinking about the intent that you're wanting to share, the intent you have bringing into the conversation, and then how do you make sure to share that up front. And you could honestly say, you could break the ice with the conversation and say, this is a really challenging conversation because I'm intimidated by your presence, but I really think that this is an important conversation to have. So again, finding the words for yourself and then having the courage to go in and have the conversation is the best advice I could give. I know we're coming right up on time. It's 12:52. We've had some really great conversation. I wanted to kind of wrap it up at the end here and just say, okay, what are some of your takeaways from the conversation that we've had today, or what other questions do you have? Cynthia, I will say your comment, silence is golden, 100% in conversations. Like giving space for someone else to respond is a big deal, is really important. Because people can process out loud, but there are a lot of people that process internally and might have to think about it before they say it. If we don't give them that space to respond, then that can shut them down. So I think that's really important to call out. Practicing mindful listening and teach back. I love all those suggestions. Those are great. What else? Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think, oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Irene, go for it.
I was just gonna say, I think considering what my intent is going into those conversations, and then, but also really being considerate of the other person and what they may be thinking or going through, and not making it about me, but definitely taking them into consideration, and just asking the open-ended questions as well, to draw them in to the conversation, and not just as I'm trying to get their perspective as well. Yeah, but being very mindful of my intent and what I want, what's the end goal? If the end is to come to a common solution, or at least a common understanding between both of us, even if we don't agree, but just understanding what my intent is going into it so that I can navigate the conversation better.
Love that. Thank you for sharing, Irene.
I wanted to say something really quick too. And really, really being very mindful of your energy.
Yes.
When you're upset and you want to have a conversation with someone, to really work on clearing that energy before you speak to them, because you're still thinking about that subconsciously in the back of your head. And then as soon as they say something that you probably feel uncomfortable about, you get defensive, so you just want to be careful, going into any conversations with anybody with not the right energy.
That is 100%. And I would say, another bonus tip that I could give y'all is to ask to circle back and say, you know what, I need 5, 10, maybe 15. I need some time and space to collect myself. And then I want to come back to this conversation. So I think knowing, absolutely being mindful of your energy, and then, but not to totally walk away from the conversation, but knowing, okay, what do you need to do to manage your energy to come back to the conversation? So excellent point. Cynthia, yes, you have your hand raised.
I think also when preparing for these conversations, you've got your intent, right? You know what you want to speak on. You've got your facts and your story. Be mindful of the other person, because the conversation may get derailed and you can't push it. It's not a sitcom. There's not going to be a happy ending after 30 minutes. So you may have to revisit that conversation again and again.
Yes. life is messy and life is not cookie cutter. It's not, like you said, it's not a TV show where it's like one conversation and it's all done up nice with the bow and the relationship's perfect at the end of the day. Like life is messy. And if these relationships are important to us, then we're going to keep showing up to them, and we're going to have to keep evaluating what's the intent I'm bringing today. What's the stories, you know, what are some of those stories that I'm telling myself? What do I want to make sure that I want to get out of the conversation, and just be sure that you keep showing up for them, and being honest and open about them, about what you want and how you can hopefully enrich the conversation and the relationship.
Hello?
Hi, Julia.
Can you-
Yes.
Yes, I was gonna ask, since I came late into the meeting, I didn't know how to work the computer. Anyway, is it okay, like, when you have conversations like on, and for discussions, like at school, is it okay to use, like, well, I know you have to use the proper etiquette or netiquette, whatever it's called. But is it okay, like, to actually tell that person, you know, I feel intimidated by you, or, I mean, I don't know how they would react or how they would feel. I mean, how they would respond to writing it down in a conversation or just doing. How do I get over that, or how do I tell this individual? Because well, like when I was at school, I told you about this individual. The only time we would have actual conversation was when we were in discussion in the writing on the internet, you know. And then when we went to class time, it was like I didn't bother to speak at all, you know. So it was very, I didn't like, you know, I didn't like the situation I was in. But how could I, is it okay to do that through writing on the internet? Or how would you do that? How would you address that situation?
I'm all about being upfront and honest and having actual dialogues and conversations. Because I feel like so much can be misinterpreted when it's written in an email, a text message, on social media, all of that. And so I say bring honesty and get clear on your intent. And I think that going into a conversation with and being open with, I'm feeling intimidated. But I think it's important that we have this conversation and that you're, again, focused on the we and not just me. I think having that clarity will help in the conversations that you're having. But I'm all about not having conversations over email or text message or social media, because so much gets lost in that if you're really needing to have a hard conversation, that you really have to have a conversation. That's my perspective.
Thank you.
Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. And I want to just make one last comment. Syria put it in the chat. Focus on the conversation and the individual. If the individual is upset and having a rough day, some important conversations may not be 100% received. I think that's so true. So I said it earlier, if you need to take time to process, like, ask for it. But if you see the other person is not going to be open to the conversation, let them know and say, hey, I think it's really important that we have this conversation. I don't think today's the right day. Let's come back to this tomorrow or when you're feeling better. Again, it's all about open conversation, honesty, and really being clear about that intent that you're bringing. And that's what I have. I think we're right at 1 o'clock.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
So that was great. I received a lot of positive comments directly to me that we want to do this again. So thank you. So I put the link in the chat box. I received a message that today's is not on there. And I was afraid of that because I'm having some trouble with my survey software. So when you go to the survey link, if you do not see difficult conversations, just say that you attended the Excel workshop, and I'll look for today's date to distinguish that, and I'll fix it on the back end. So if you're a certified CHW and need a non-DSHS certified CE, which you can, as a reminder, you can use 10 of throughout the year, over 2 years, I believe, please complete the survey. And then our next workshop will be October 19th by Michelle Mandy, and it's going to build off of this conversation and specifically focus on using language in communication to prevent violence in the health workplace. So that will be our 5th one. So thank you, everyone. I will stay on a little bit longer to leave the link up, but I will stop recording now.